Today we're going to take a look at our second to last unit in our economics curriculum, namely the factor market. Luckily, the factor market is a relatively quick unit of study, largely because it builds on some of the concepts that we've spoken about previously, namely marginality, profit maximizing, supply and demand, etc. The largest stumbling block in understanding the factor market is understanding the new terminologies that we use and apply. So please pay attention to those new vocab words as we take a look at this. We'll begin our study of the factor market with an understanding of where it goes within our entire economy. What we have here is known as the circular flow model of economic activity in economics, and basically it is the simplest representation of an entire economy that we have. On the left-hand side, we've got households. On the right-hand side, we've got business firms. And it's interesting to note that households and firms are connected to each other in several different ways. For our previous units, we've been talking about this portion of the connections, namely the transfer of goods and services from firms to households in exchange for money, payment for those goods and services returning to the firms. This is what we've been talking about in the product market. We've discussed 4 different market structures within the product market: perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. But all of those discussions centered around the selling of goods and services up here in the product market. Here in our last unit, the factor market, we are talking about resources that are coming from households to firms in exchange for payment for resources, wages for labor, rent for land, etc. So we are going to concentrate now on this lower portion of the circular flow model and understand that whatever happens in one market, the product market for example, has an impact on the factor market, or something that happens in the factor market is clearly going to have an impact on the product market. So let's begin our examination of the factor market with an explanation and understanding of some new vocabulary terms. In our examination of the product market, we were taking a look at how firms would produce goods in such a way as to maximize their total profit. And we'll recall that we used the rule of marginal revenue equaling marginal cost to maximize profit for the firm. And what that meant is that they should continue to produce goods until the income from one more good was equivalent to the cost of one more good. In such a way, all the previous goods that they had made would provide a greater marginal revenue than a marginal cost, and the firm's total benefit or total profit would be maximized when they're equal. Just to reiterate then, when we use marginal revenue and marginal cost as our terms, we are taking a look at the impact of one more good. In the factor market, things are going to be a little bit different, although the ultimate goal is the same. We are still wanting to achieve a maximum profit, and to do this, we're going to produce until the marginal revenue product is equal to the marginal factor cost. So we need to have a greater understanding of what this means so that we can understand how firms will maximize profit by hiring various amounts of resources. So marginal revenue product then is the income from one more resource or from one more worker. So workers produce goods or services for a firm, and in turn the firm is able to sell those goods. And so a worker can be seen as a means to an end, that they are bringing in revenue to the company. So there are 2 ways that we can calculate this marginal revenue product. Probably the most important way to remember this is the marginal revenue times the marginal product. What we're doing here is we're taking a look at the money from one more good and multiplying that by the productivity of one more worker. And that will give us the productivity of one more worker as measured in dollars. The other way that we can achieve the same thing is by taking a look at the change in total revenue and dividing that by the change in workers, or any other factor that we happen to be talking about. On the other hand, we have to look at the marginal factor cost. Just one more time, that remembering the marginal cost in the product market is the cost of producing one more good. But the marginal factor cost is the cost of hiring one more resource. So we want to make sure that we understand this. So the marginal factor cost is the cost of one more worker. And we have to be aware that the cost of one more worker is not always the wage of that one more worker. But we'll take a look at that in just a minute. One of the simplifications of the factor market in comparison to the product market is the fact that instead of 4 market structures, we only have 2 in the factor market. And we have to be careful because one of them is named the same thing as a name in the product market, but they do mean 2 very different things. So let's talk about the perfectly competitive firm in the factor market. So since we're talking about perfect competition, there are some similarities between the factor market and the product market. Namely, that the perfectly competitive industry is comprised of many firms that are pulling from the same pool of workers. So the industry has many firms, as opposed to the firm, which is just a single entity that is hiring from within that pool, the same that all the other firms are doing this. So it's important to note that when we're talking about perfectly competitive factor markets, we are going to have to use side-by-side graphs that we should be familiar with from the product market. A point of comparison between the perfectly competitive firm in the factor market is that they are wage takers. They are going to accept the wage that is established by the industry, and that the firm can hire as many workers as it would like at that wage. That's an important phrase. The College Board likes to use that as sort of a code to let you know that they are talking about a perfectly competitive factor market when they say that a firm can hire as many workers as it likes at a wage rate of $15 an hour or whatever wage they happen to pick. So the perfectly competitive firms are wage takers, which means that there's a perfectly elastic supply curve. And we'll remind ourselves that when we're talking about elasticity, and particularly perfectly elastic, that we're talking about a horizontal curve to be perfectly elastic. And what this implies is that there is an absolute sensitivity to the change in price, such that if the wage of workers were to be anything higher than the established wage, it wouldn't provide any additional workers, because we're already having, according to this graph, an infinite number of workers willing to work at a given wage. The further implication is that each one of those workers has 0 economic rent. I'll ask you to take a look at that separately, but in essence what that means is that all workers in a perfectly competitive factor market are earning exactly what they would be making in their next best alternative. So they have 0 economic rent because there is no difference between what they're earning and their transfer earnings. Let's now examine then how a perfectly competitive factor market works. Notice that we do have our side-by-side graphs. We've got on the left the industry and on the right the firm. So the firm is simply a single business within the industry. Of note, these firms do not have to produce the same good. We should be reminded that these firms are simply hiring the same workers, not necessarily producing the same good. And these firms are hiring their workers from the perfectly competitive factor market, or the industry of workers. So within this industry, there is a downward sloping demand curve for workers and an upward sloping supply curve of workers. Both of these intuitively should make sense. It's worth noting that the supply curve is determined by the employees. As wages rise, more workers are willing to work, and those workers are willing to work more hours. On the other hand, as the wages increase, the employers are willing to hire less, such that at high wages, businesses want to hire a few workers, but as the wage comes down, the business would like to hire more workers. So what we have here is a market equilibrium that has been established, that at a given price, the number of workers that are willing to work is equal to the number of jobs that are available in the market. By definition, that means we have zero unemployment, that everybody that's willing to work for this wage has a job at this wage. So that's noteworthy. The other thing of note is that because the firms within this industry are wage takers, they accept that wage as being the price that they're going to pay for their workers. So the cost of one more worker is equal to that supply curve that's available to them. So from the perspective of one firm within this industry, they can hire as many workers as they like at a given wage. The question then remains, well, how many workers will they seek to hire? And that's going to depend upon the revenue that each of those workers brings in. Remember that workers are a means to an end for this firm. And so we can graph our marginal revenue product curve that should look something like this, that each additional worker is bringing in fewer goods because of the law of diminishing marginal returns, and so the amount of revenue that's brought in by each additional worker will also decrease. The firm will then hire the number of workers that exists when the additional money from one more worker, that is the marginal revenue product, is equal to the additional money the firm has to spend to get that worker, the marginal factor cost. And if this is true, then the firm will have successfully maximized its profit by hiring the workers where marginal revenue product equals marginal factor cost. There are a few things worth noting here. First, let's start with the marginal revenue product of the firm. This is, again, the money that each additional worker provides to the firm, and in essence, this marginal revenue product acts as the firm's demand curve for labor, right? So that this is equivalent to the demand curve for the firm that they have for labor. We also have to be aware of the demand curve in the industry, and that these two are not unrelated. Specifically, we can see that if there are 1,000 firms in the industry, each with their own demand curves, if we were to add those demand curves together, such that we take all of these demand curves of the 1,000 firms and add them together, we're going to arrive at the industry demand curve. So, the industry demand curve can be understood as the sum of marginal revenue product curves from the individual businesses. This points to another interesting analysis as well, that if something were to happen for this firm, that this firm's individual demand for labor were to rise, perhaps the good that that firm sells has increased in demand, which might increase the price of the good, which would increase the marginal revenue from the good, we would expect that for the firm, and maybe for this firm only, we would have a new marginal revenue product curve, right? That if marginal revenue product is marginal revenue times marginal product, then if the price of the good goes up, then the demand for the workers goes up. And that's significant because as this marginal revenue product curve rises, it is only for this one particular firm. So the demand curve in the industry is unaffected because the firm is too small. It does, however, have a significant impact inasmuch as the marginal revenue product now intersects the marginal factor cost at a greater quantity of workers. So that if the demand for this firm's workers were to increase, or this firm's demand for workers were to increase, they wouldn't necessarily pay more for those workers, they would simply hire more of them. This is an important concept when we understand the notion of derived demand. Derived demand is central to our understanding of the factor market. This is simply the notion that the demand for workers comes from the demand for the goods that those workers produce. This can be understood when we take a look at our marginal revenue product. That, remember, marginal revenue product is the income, it's the end that firms are seeking when they're hiring workers. So it's the income from one more worker. and it can be derived by multiplying marginal revenue times marginal product. So if the demand for the good rises, the demand for the good that the workers produce rises, the marginal revenue will increase. If marginal revenue increases, because it's multiplied by marginal product to arrive at marginal revenue product will also increase. This is a very important notion, that the demand for workers comes from the demand for the goods that are produced. Of note, the other thing that can increase the demand for workers is the productivity of those workers. If you were to come up with a new technique that allowed your workers to work at a faster rate, or came up with a tool that assisted those workers, that would increase their marginal productivity, which would in turn increase their marginal revenue product, which in turn would increase the demand that the firm has for those. But remember, if it only impacts the marginal revenue product of the one firm, this isn't going to increase the wage, because the wage is determined by the industry, as they are wage takers. It's time for us to close our examination of perfectly competitive factor markets and take a look at monopsony, the only other factor market structure that we need to be aware of. True monopsonies are probably rather rare in the world. A monopsony is when there's a single demander of a resource, such that there's only one firm that is doing all of the hiring in a particular geographic area. We can imagine that these situations certainly have taken place today and in the past. An isolated coal town in West Virginia, where the coal mine is the single employer for almost everybody in the town. The town of Pullman that we are aware of from American history, where if you worked in the town of Pullman or lived in the town of Pullman, you worked for the Pullman Railroad Company. Or the possibility of a large hospital in a rural area, that it was a single hirer that dominates the labor force in that particular area. And when we have monopsony, we're going to have a very different understanding of how that labor market is going to work. Because monopsonies are the only source of work in the town, we have to understand that in order for them to find more workers, they're probably going to have to increase their wages. Such that if there was one worker that was willing to work at $8 an hour, that's it. Nobody else is willing to work at $8 an hour. In order to get a second worker, the monopsony is going to have to increase the wage to $9 an hour. Remember that we can contrast this with the perfectly competitive firm that could hire as many workers as it wanted at a given wage, that they can simply hire more workers without having to increase the wages. This has a significant impact on the monopsony, in that as they raise the wage to hire more workers, they have to raise the wage for all of the workers. That is, that we assume that there is no wage discrimination, similar to what we saw in the product market, that there was no price discrimination with a monopoly. So because there is no wage discrimination, the firm cannot simply hire the second worker for $9. They have to pay two workers $9 apiece. That has an interesting impact on the cost of hiring the second worker. Let's understand what this is going to look like by taking a look at what the total factor cost is for the monopsony in this situation. That when they hire two workers, 2 times 9 is 18, 3 times 10 is 30, 4 workers at $11 apiece is $44, and 5 workers times 12 is 60. That's not very surprising. However, what is interesting to examine then is the marginal factor cost of hiring each additional worker. For example, the cost of hiring the third worker is not simply $10. You do have to pay that third worker $10 to induce them to start working for the firm. However, because the two previous workers were willing to work for $9 apiece, to get that third worker at $10, you're also going to have to give a raise to those other 2 workers that were willing to work for less. So the cost of hiring 3 workers is $30, which is $12 more than the cost of hiring 2 workers. Therefore, the cost of hiring the third worker, the marginal factor cost, is going to be $12. So we can see here that our marginal factor costs are distinctly different from our wage rates that we have. It starts at the same point, but as the wage rate rises, the marginal factor cost rises at an even faster rate because the next hired worker's cost has to include a raise to the workers that were willing to work for less because of our assumption of no wage discrimination. Let's take a look at what this looks like on a graph. So as we saw, the number of workers willing to work increases as the wage rate increases, so that more and more workers show up as the wage rises. And that's not a surprise. Neither is it a surprise that we've got a marginal revenue product curve that looks just like what we've seen before, that the law of diminishing marginal returns still applies, so the additional money from one more worker will decrease as you hire additional workers because they're selling less and less goods, because they're producing less goods. What is of note here is this marginal factor cost curve. Remember that when we had the perfectly competitive factor market, the marginal factor cost for the firm was a horizontal, perfectly elastic supply curve. Here, the supply is different from the marginal factor cost. The number of workers willing to work for a given wage differs from the cost of hiring that additional worker. So just as we had seen on our graph, it starts the same. The cost of hiring the first worker is equivalent to the first worker's wage, but the second worker gets paid more to work, but we also have to give a raise to the first worker now that the second worker is getting paid a higher amount. So the marginal factor cost is greater than the wage rate for the entirety of the market after the first worker. But that's the only difference. Now we use our analysis and we know that to maximize profit, the firm should hire where marginal factor cost equals marginal revenue product. And we can see here that that takes place for this monopsony with 4 workers. What we have to then consider is what is the wage going to be for those workers. The mistake that many people make is they say, oh, well, the wage comes from where marginal factor cost equals marginal revenue product and is somewhere over here. That's simply not the case, though. Remember that the supply curve equals the wage so that we can determine the wage for each of these 4 workers by where it intersects the supply curve. And then we can come over and take a look at something like this. So the workers are going to get paid at this amount, but the number of workers will be determined by where marginal factor cost equals marginal revenue product. One other analysis becomes apparent as we take a look at this, that the marginal revenue product of the monopsony is synonymous with the marginal revenue product of all of the firms in the industry, such that this marginal revenue product is equal to the sum of all marginal revenue products in the industry. Why is that important? Well, if we were to snap our fingers and change this monopsony into a perfectly competitive factor market, this line isn't going to change. The marginal revenue products of all the firms in the industry would be equivalent to the marginal revenue product of the single monopsonist. We can then take a look at the impact that this would have, that under conditions of perfect competition, the supply is equal to the demand at a different location, such that more workers would be hired, and because this is the wage rate, they would get paid a higher wage. This is a very important consideration, that more workers would be hired at a higher wage under conditions of a perfectly competitive factor market compared to the monopsony. When we take a step back and consider the impact of the monopsony on the labor market, the impact on wages, that is that they lower wages and hire less workers, the impact on employment, makes sense. If there's a single firm, they do not have to succumb to the competitive pressures of the industry and therefore can work to suppress wages and suppress the number of workers being hired. Similar to what a monopoly does in the product market, because they don't face competitive pressures, they can produce fewer goods at a higher price than would a perfectly competitive industry. That concludes our examination of the factor market, focusing on the perfectly competitive and monopsony market structures. If you have any questions, take a look at your workbook, your textbook, or see me after class.